A retired judge collapses on the courthouse steps, gasping for air as bystanders freeze, until a young woman rushes in, saving his life. But when he wakes in the hospital, expecting to thank her, she refuses his gratitude. Instead, she leans in with a demand that leaves him shaken to his core. "You sentenced my father to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Now you're going to fix it." As the truth unravels, so does everything he thought he knew about justice, redemption, and himself. How did he get it so wrong? And will he risk everything to make it right? Stay with us for a story of guilt, truth, and a second chance that comes decades too late. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn wind whispered through the courthouse columns, rustling fallen leaves across worn stone steps. Walter Harrington pulled his black wool coat tighter, feeling every one of his 68 years in his tired bones. The old courthouse loomed behind him, its red bricks faded by countless seasons, grand pillars standing like silent guardians of justice. Pigeons scattered as a gust of wind swept past, their wings catching the weak afternoon light. He lifted his weathered face to the sky where dark clouds gathered like his own heavy thoughts. A deep sigh escaped his lips, visible in the crisp air. His polished shoes clicked against the stone steps as he began his descent, each step careful and measured, just as his judgments had been during his years on the bench. The leather briefcase in his left hand felt heavier than usual today. Suddenly, a sharp pain gripped his chest like an iron fist. Walter gasped, his breath catching in his throat. The pain intensified, spreading through his upper body like lightning, radiating down his left arm. His hand clutched at his chest, fingers digging into the wool of his coat. The world tilted sideways as his vision began to blur at the edges, the courthouse steps becoming a dizzying maze before him. "No," he whispered, but his legs wouldn't listen. His knees buckled beneath him, and the cold stone steps rushed up to meet him. His briefcase clattered down the steps, papers spilling across the worn stone. People on the sidewalk below stopped in their tracks. A woman in a business suit covered her mouth, her pearl necklace catching the dim light. A young man with a briefcase took half a step forward, then hesitated, pulling out his phone but not dialing. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, but no one moved to help the fallen judge. Some even took a few steps back, as if misfortune might be contagious. Ava Carter had just finished a grueling 8-hour shift at the diner 2 blocks away. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, and the plastic grocery bag cut into her fingers. The smell of French fries still clung to her uniform, and exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders. She looked up at the sound of gasps and saw the crowd gathering at the courthouse steps. When she spotted the crumpled figure in the black coat, she didn't hesitate. Her grocery bag hit the sidewalk, cans rolling across concrete, an apple bouncing down the street. "Move!" she shouted, pushing through the stunned onlookers. Her ponytail had come loose during her shift, dark strands falling around her face as she dropped to her knees beside the fallen man. The concrete scraped her skin through her worn uniform pants. Her fingers pressed against his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular, fluttering like a trapped bird beneath her fingertips. His skin felt cold and clammy under her touch. His face had taken on a grayish tint that she recognized from her basic first aid training at the diner. Small beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the autumn chill. "Heart attack," she muttered. Without wasting another second, she positioned her hands on his chest and began compressions. "Someone call 911, she shouted at the crowd, not stopping the rhythm of her movements. A few people finally snapped out of their daze, phones appearing in trembling hands. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she counted compressions under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her arms burned, muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. The world narrowed to just this: the rhythm of her hands, the count in her head, the desperate need to keep this stranger's heart beating. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. Walter's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. They were pale blue, clouded with pain but somehow gentle as they met hers. Recognition flickered across his face, though Ava couldn't understand why. His lips moved, trying to form words, but no sound came out before his eyes closed again. His breath came in shallow gasps. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the bottom of the steps, its red and white lights painting the scene in alternating flashes. 2 paramedics rushed up with their equipment, quickly taking control of the situation. Ava stepped back, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. She watched them work, her heart still pounding in her chest, her uniform soaked with sweat despite the cold. They loaded Walter onto a stretcher, efficiently securing him and checking his vitals. The electrodes of a portable EKG machine were quickly attached to his chest, the machine's steady beeping a reassuring sound in the tense air. As they prepared to move him to the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Ava. "Are you his family?" he asked, his voice professional but kind. His name tag read, Mike, and his eyes were warm with concern. Ava shook her head, suddenly aware of how disheveled she looked in her diner uniform, the name tag crooked, her hair a mess. "No," she said softly. "I just couldn't let him die." She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the autumn chill for the first time since she'd dropped her groceries. She stood in the middle of the street, watching as they loaded him into the ambulance. The siren started up again, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving her alone with the scattered remains of her groceries and the lingering echo of a stranger's heartbeat beneath her hands. The crowd began to disperse, returning to their lives as if nothing had happened, while Ava remained rooted to the spot, knowing somehow that her life had just changed irrevocably. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life in Walter's consciousness as his heavy eyelids struggled open. The steady beep of medical equipment created a monotonous rhythm that matched his heartbeat. His mouth felt dry as desert sand, and his chest ached with each labored breath, a constant reminder of what had brought him here. White ceiling tiles came into focus above him, their familiar institutional pattern swimming in his vision. Where was he? The last thing he remembered was leaving the courthouse, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. Then pain, sharp and overwhelming like a vice grip around his chest. The antiseptic smell burned his nostrils, grounding him in the reality of a hospital room, mixing with the faint scent of cleaning supplies and fresh linens. A chair creaked somewhere to his left. Walter turned his head slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. Near the window sat a young woman, her arms crossed over her waitress uniform, the name tag partially visible but too far to read. Morning light filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting strips of gold across her face and catching the slight tremor in her hands. She looked tired but alert, dark circles under her eyes suggesting a long night's vigil, watching him with intense dark eyes that seemed to hold untold depths of emotion. Walter's throat felt like sandpaper as he tried to speak. "Who?" He had to clear his throat, the sound rough and painful, like grinding stones. "Who are you?" The young woman leaned forward in her chair, her expression carefully neutral, though something flickered behind her eyes, determination perhaps, or barely contained anger. "The girl who saved your life," she stated matter-of-factly, her voice steady and controlled, betraying years of practiced restraint. Fragments of memory flashed through Walter's mind. Someone performing CPR, strong hands pressing rhythmically against his chest, a determined face above him before everything went dark. The phantom sensation of those compressions still lingered. He blinked slowly, trying to gather his scattered thoughts through the fog of medication. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice still weak and raspy. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the bedside table where his personal belongings lay, the movement causing his IV line to shift uncomfortably. Finding his wallet, he pulled it closer with clumsy fingers. "I can compensate you." A sharp scoff cut through the air like a knife. The young woman shook her head, disgust flickering across her features, aging her momentarily. "I don't want your money," she said firmly, each word precise and measured. "I want justice." Walter's hand froze halfway to his wallet. He stared at her, confusion clouding his tired eyes. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, the set of her jaw, perhaps, or the way she held herself. But his mind couldn't quite grasp it through the haze of post-cardiac care. She must have seen the confusion on his face because her jaw clenched tight, a muscle working beneath the skin. Every muscle in her body seemed to tense as she asked, "You don't remember me, do you?" Walter searched her face more carefully now, the determined set of her jaw, the weariness around her eyes that seemed too old for someone so young, the way her fingers gripped the arms of her chair. But no recognition came, just an unsettling sense that he should know her. She stood up suddenly, her movements sharp and deliberate, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Each step toward his bed seemed to carry the weight of years of waiting, her shoes making soft squeaking sounds against the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was like steel wrapped in silk, controlled but with an edge that could cut through bone. "You sentenced my father to 25 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit." The words hit Walter like a physical blow, making him sink deeper into his hospital pillows. The steady beeping of his heart monitor picked up speed as realization dawned, the machine betraying his shock. He remembered now. The trial. The evidence that had seemed so conclusive at the time. The man who had maintained his innocence until the end, standing tall even as the verdict was read. Marcus Carter. This must be his daughter, all grown up from the little girl who had watched her father being led away in handcuffs. "Now you're going to fix it." Her words weren't a request but a declaration of war. They hung in the air between them, heavy with years of pain and determination, filling the room with an almost electric tension. Walter could only stare back at her, the full weight of what she was saying sinking into his chest alongside the dull ache of his heart attack. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced between them like tiny witnesses, while the magnitude of their connection settled into the sterile hospital air. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor counted out the seconds of this life-changing moment, marking the beginning of what would become either his redemption or his final judgment. The afternoon rain created a somber backdrop as water streaked down the hospital window, casting shifting shadows across the sterile room. Walter's temples throbbed under his fingertips, the weight of exhaustion and medication making his thoughts sluggish and unfocused. "Your father?" he muttered, his voice scratchy and uncertain, like sandpaper on wood. Ava stood firm, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her stance radiating a determination that seemed to fill the small room. "Marcus Carter." The name struck Walter with such force that he physically recoiled against his pillows, the motion sending a sharp pain through his chest. Images flooded his mind. The wood-paneled courtroom, the harsh overhead lights that had cast unforgiving shadows, and a young man in a bright orange jumpsuit that seemed to scream of guilt before any evidence was presented. Marcus Carter had stood there, his eyes clear and steady, begging anyone to believe him. Walter remembered how confident he'd felt back then, how certain of his decision, how righteous in his authority. "I remember the case," Walter said quietly, his hands fidgeting with the thin hospital blanket, twisting it between his fingers. "The convenience store robbery. The shooting." Each word felt heavy on his tongue, laden with memories he'd tried to forget. "The wrong man," Ava countered, her voice sharp but controlled, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "The wrong life you destroyed." Her words carried the weight of countless sleepless nights and tear-stained pillows. The rain grew heavier outside, drumming against the glass with increasing intensity, nature's own percussion to this confrontation. Walter's heart monitor beeped a little faster as memories continued to surface, each beep a stark reminder of his vulnerability. The sentencing day stood out most clearly now. Marcus Carter's face hadn't shown rage or defiance, just a deep, crushing resignation as the guards led him away, his shoulders slumped under the weight of injustice. The evidence had seemed ironclad at the time. The witness identification, though slightly hesitant, the grainy security footage that showed someone of similar build, the gun found near his home in a neighborhood where weapons weren't uncommon. But now, looking at Ava's unwavering stare, doubt began to creep into Walter's mind like a cold draft through an unsealed window. Her eyes held the same steady gaze as her father's had all those years ago, filled with the same quiet dignity that had haunted his dreams. What if he had been wrong? What if his certainty had been misplaced? built on foundations of assumption and prejudice he hadn't even recognized. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass beside his bed, the ice cubes clinking softly against the plastic. "What do you want from me?" The question came out barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of potential consequences. Ava didn't hesitate, her response immediate and firm. "Reopen the case." "The case was years ago," Walter started to say, but Ava stepped forward, cutting him off, her shadow falling across his hospital bed like an accusation. "And my father has spent every day of those years behind bars for something he didn't do." Her voice cracked slightly, revealing the pain beneath her composed exterior, like a glimpse of raw flesh under a bandage. "Every birthday, every holiday, every normal Tuesday, he spent them all in a cell because of your mistake." Each word was carefully chosen, a precise strike at his conscience. Walter fell silent. The steady patter of rain filled the quiet space between them, nature's reminder of time's relentless march. He looked at her again, really looked this time, seeing beyond his own assumptions. He saw the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of endless nights spent worrying, the tension in her shoulders from carrying an impossible burden, the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, knuckles white with determination. He noticed how her waitress uniform was slightly wrinkled, probably from rushing here after her shift, the name tag slightly askew. This wasn't just some crusader looking for justice. This was a daughter fighting for her father's life, carrying the weight of her family's tragedy in every step. His hands tightened into fists on top of the blanket, the thin material bunching under his grip. For the first time in 25 years, Walter allowed himself to consider a terrifying possibility: that he might have ruined an innocent man's life, and with it the lives of everyone who loved him. The thought settled in his chest like a stone, heavy with the responsibility of decades of injustice. The morning sun crept through the hospital blinds, casting thin strips of light across Walter's tired face. He hadn't slept a wink, his mind too busy replaying Ava's words over and over. 25 years. A quarter of a century behind bars, because of his decision. The gravity of it made his breath catch in his throat. Walter shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed, his chest still sore from yesterday's heart attack. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside him, but he barely noticed it anymore. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, counting the tiny dots in the tiles as if they might somehow provide answers. Each dot seemed to mock him, like the countless days Marcus Carter had spent locked away. His whole career, his reputation as a fair and just judge, what if it had all been built on mistakes like this? The thought made his stomach churn. Years of pride in his work crumbled like a house of cards, leaving him dizzy with doubt. With trembling hands, Walter reached for his old leather briefcase on the bedside table. The familiar smell of worn leather and paper filled his nose as he opened it. Inside, meticulously organized folders contained records of his most significant cases. He'd always kept detailed personal archives, a habit that had served him well over the years. Now, that same thoroughness might reveal his greatest failure. His fingers found the folder labeled Carter Marcus. The edges were yellowed with age, the paper brittle under his touch. A grainy black and white courtroom photograph slipped out. Marcus Carter's young face stared back at him. Not angry or defiant, just defeated. Those eyes seemed to pierce through time itself, haunting Walter with their quiet resignation. Walter began reading the case files, his eyes moving slowly across each line at first. The robbery charges, the eyewitness testimony, the circumstantial evidence. He remembered feeling so certain back then, so convinced of his own infallibility. The memory of his confidence now felt like acid in his throat. But as he dug deeper into the stack, his reading became more urgent, almost frantic. Then he saw it, a document he'd somehow forgotten about or overlooked. His hands started shaking as he read the witness statement, dated 3 years after the trial. The key witness had recanted their testimony, claiming pressure from local law enforcement to identify Marcus. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the implications sank in. The paper nearly slipped from Walter's grip. How had this been ignored? Why hadn't this triggered an immediate review? His mind raced through possible explanations, each one more damning than the last. He went back to the beginning, reading every single page again with new eyes. The evidence he'd once thought was solid now seemed to crumble under scrutiny. The timeline of events had holes. The witness descriptions didn't quite match. That recanted testimony. It changed everything. With each revelation, the weight of his mistake grew heavier. Walter leaned back against his pillows, letting out a long, shaky breath. The certainty he'd carried for 25 years was dissolving, replaced by a gnawing doubt that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. His hands clutched the bedsheets, seeking any anchor in this storm of revelation. He closed the file slowly, his fingers lingering on the folder's edge. He'd always told himself this case was closed, justice had been served. But now, in the quiet of his hospital room, surrounded by the evidence of his possible mistake, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. The sterile hospital air felt thick with the ghosts of his past decisions. The weight of those 25 years pressed down on his chest, heavier than any heart attack. Each breath felt like a reminder of the freedom he'd denied another man, and the responsibility he now carried to make it right. The hospital room door flew open with a bang, making Walter jump. Ava Carter burst in, her work uniform wrinkled and stained with coffee, her eyes blazing with determination. Her name tag was crooked, suggesting she'd come straight from her shift. Walter didn't look up right away. He couldn't tear his eyes from the yellowed pages of Marcus Carter's case file, particularly the recanted testimony that now seemed to mock him from the page, the words blurring together as his conscience gnawed at him. "So, are you going to help me or not?" Ava's voice cut through the steady beeping of the heart monitor, sharp as a knife. Walter slowly raised himself to a sitting position, wincing at the lingering pain in his chest. The movement made his heart monitor spike briefly. He tugged at his hospital gown, trying to maintain some dignity in the thin cotton garment. "It's complicated," he muttered, knowing how weak the words sounded even as they left his mouth. How hollow they must seem to her. "Complicated?" Ava's voice rose sharply, echoing off the sterile walls. "My father is in prison because of you." Walter pressed his fingers against his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. Everything he'd built over his career, his reputation as a fair judge, his legacy of upholding justice, the respect of his peers, it could all crumble if he admitted to such a grave mistake. But Ava wasn't interested in his internal struggle or his carefully constructed world. She stepped closer to his bed, her hands balled into fists at her sides, her voice shaking with emotion. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. "Do you know what it was like growing up without him? Watching my mother die, waiting for him to come home?" Walter flinched at her words, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her accusations. "Every single weekend," Ava continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I took 2 buses to visit him in prison. I was 8 years old, sitting across from my daddy at a metal table, trying to tell him about school while guards watched our every move like we were criminals." She took a shaky breath. "Mom got sick when I was 15. She just gave up, stopped fighting. She died still believing he'd come home someday." Walter sat perfectly still, each word hitting him like a physical blow, the truth of them impossible to deny. "I had to drop out of college," Ava said, her voice quieter now but no less intense. "Couldn't afford it. Had to work 2 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. Started as a waitress, then picked up night shifts cleaning offices. And all this time, my father sat in a cell for something he didn't do." She moved even closer, gripping the rail of his hospital bed until her knuckles turned white. "You put him there. You can help get him out." Walter finally looked up, meeting her fierce gaze. The weight of guilt pressed heavily on his chest, worse than any heart attack. For the first time, he truly saw the ripple effects of his decision, not just on Marcus Carter but on this young woman who'd lost both parents in different ways, all because of his ruling. The faces of his own children flashed through his mind, and he couldn't help but imagine them in Ava's position. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the case file. The paper crackled beneath his fingers like autumn leaves, "I need to look deeper into this," he finally said. Ava didn't smile or thank him. She just gave a short, sharp nod, her expression unchanged. The hope in her eyes, though carefully guarded, was unmistakable. The autumn sun filtered through the study's dusty windows as Walter eased himself into his worn leather chair. His chest still ached from the heart attack, a constant reminder of his mortality. The familiar creak of the chair seemed to echo through the house, which felt emptier than usual today, the silence heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. With careful movements, his joints protesting slightly, he pulled out the archived files of Marcus Carter's case. The manila folder was yellow with age, its edges frayed and worn like an old map. Papers crackled as he opened it, the musty smell of old documents filling his nostrils, bringing back memories of countless hours in chambers. 25 years. These papers had sentenced a man to 25 years. Walter spread the documents across his mahogany desk, arranging them chronologically with practiced precision. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he began reviewing each page with meticulous attention, the way he'd done thousands of times before. Something felt wrong almost immediately, making his stomach clench. "This can't be right," he muttered, comparing the original police report to the trial records, leaning forward in his chair. According to the police report, the robbery occurred at 10:15 p.m., but the key witness testified to seeing Marcus at 9:45 p.m. The timeline made no sense. It was physically impossible for someone to be in two places at once. His fingers trembled slightly as he dug deeper, moving papers with growing urgency. Witness statements contradicted each other in ways that should have raised red flags. Evidence that should have been thoroughly examined was barely mentioned, dismissed with cursory notes. How had he missed these glaring inconsistencies? What else had he overlooked? Then, buried beneath court transcripts and legal motions, he found it. A letter, its paper thin and delicate, like autumn leaves ready to crumble. The date stamp showed it arrived 3 days before sentencing. Walter's heart began to race as he read, his mouth going dry. "Dear Judge Harrington, I need to change my statement about what I saw that night. I made a mistake. I can't live with sending an innocent man to prison." The letter was from Sarah Jenkins, the primary witness, the same witness whose testimony had been crucial in convicting Marcus, whose words he had cited in his sentencing statement. But this letter had never made it into the official record. Someone had deliberately buried it. Walter grabbed a legal pad and began making notes, his normally steady handwriting now shaky and urgent, like a doctor's scrawl. The evidence mounted with each page he reviewed, each revelation more damning than the last. This wasn't just a simple oversight or honest mistake. This was a fundamental breakdown of justice, a systematic failure that had destroyed a man's life. The system he'd devoted his life to upholding had failed spectacularly, and he had been part of that failure, a willing participant in this tragedy. His pen clattered to the desk as the full weight of realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd sentenced an innocent man to prison. Marcus Carter had lost 25 years of his life because Walter hadn't looked closely enough, hadn't questioned enough, hadn't done his job properly. The weight of those lost years seemed to press down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Walter picked up the witness's letter again, his hands shaking more noticeably now. The paper felt like it was burning his fingers, each word a testament to his failure. He knew what needed to happen next, though the thought made his heart race dangerously. He had to look Marcus Carter in the eye. He had to face the man whose life he'd destroyed. It was the least he could do, the beginning of what he hoped would be a long journey toward making things right. The morning fog hung low over Redwood State Penitentiary as Walter guided his car through the entrance gate, his tires splashing through puddles from the previous night's rain. The massive concrete walls loomed ahead, a stark reminder of the lives contained within. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he pulled into a visitor spot, the gravel crunching under his tires like broken glass. Walter sat in his car for a moment, gathering his courage, his breath fogging up the window beside him. The building before him felt different now. He'd visited prisons countless times as a judge, always with authority and purpose, his head held high. Today he felt small, diminished by the weight of what he had to do. A guard met him at the entrance. Officer Mills, according to his badge, which caught the morning light with a dull gleam. The man's face remained neutral as he checked Walter's ID and visitor pass, his eyes scanning each document with practiced efficiency. The metal detector beeped, and Walter removed his watch, belt, and loose change, placing them in the gray plastic bin with trembling fingers. Standard procedure, but it felt more invasive than ever before. The halls seemed endless, each footstep echoing off the concrete walls like a ghostly reminder of his purpose here. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to follow him down the corridor. Other visitors huddled in plastic chairs, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion, some clutching photos or letters like precious lifelines. Walter's polished shoes felt out of place on the scuffed linoleum floor, each step a quiet reminder that he didn't belong. When the door opened and Marcus Carter stepped through, time seemed to stop, the air growing thick and heavy. Marcus moved with careful precision, his prison uniform neat and pressed, as if clinging to this small measure of dignity. Gray peppered his temples and deep lines marked his face like a map of the years he'd lost. But his eyes, those were what struck Walter the most. They weren't angry or bitter as he'd expected. They were simply tired, worn down by the weight of injustice. Marcus's laugh cut through the silence, a sound devoid of humor, hollow as an empty cell. Well, well, look who finally decided to visit. He settled into the chair across from Walter, his movements measured and controlled like a man who'd learned the hard way to watch every gesture. Walter's mouth felt dry as sandpaper. "I need to talk to you about your case," he managed, his voice smaller than he intended, barely carrying across the table between them. Marcus leaned back, studying Walter with those weary eyes that seemed to see right through him. "What took you so long?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with 25 years of waiting, of hopes raised and dashed. Walter cleared his throat, shuffling the papers he'd brought like a shield between them. "I've been reviewing everything. The witness statements, the evidence." "I told you the truth back then," Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but firm as steel. "But you didn't listen, none of you did." Each word carried the weight of countless sleepless nights and endless days behind bars. The weight of those words pressed down on Walter's shoulders like a physical burden. He tried to press forward, pulling out his notes with unsteady hands. About the night of the robbery. Marcus shook his head, cutting him off again, his expression a mixture of resignation and barely contained pain. "I already gave my statement. What? You want a different version now?" His calm demeanor cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the pain underneath, like looking through a crack in a wall. Walter sighed, setting the papers down in defeat. He'd prepared arguments, questions, theories, but faced with Marcus's quiet dignity, they all felt hollow, like empty promises echoing in an empty room. Marcus pushed his chair back and stood, his height casting a shadow over the table that seemed to stretch forever. "Come back when you're ready to do more than just talk." He turned away, and Walter watched helplessly as he walked toward the door, each step measured and deliberate like a man who'd learned that rushing never made freedom come any faster. The guard buzzed Marcus through, and the heavy door clanged shut behind him with a finality that made Walter flinch. He sat alone at the table, the echo of that final statement ringing in his ears like a judgment. The storm outside Walter's study matched his turbulent thoughts, thunder rolling across the sky as rain pelted against the windows with increasing fury. His desk lamp cast a warm circle of light on the scattered papers before him, but the shadows in the corners of the room felt heavy with secrets, like silent accusers waiting to speak. Walter's tired eyes burned as he studied the witness statements for what felt like the 100th time, the words beginning to blur together on the page. Marcus's words from their prison meeting echoed in his mind. "I told you the truth back then." His fingers traced the yellowed pages, wondering how many details he'd missed, how many signs he'd ignored, how many red flags he'd dismissed in his younger, more certain days. The old grandfather clock in the corner struck 9, its deep chimes making him jump, the sound reverberating through his bones. Walter reached for his phone, his hand hovering over the keypad for a moment before dialing a number he hadn't called in years, his heart pounding with each digit pressed. Frank Delaney answered on the fourth ring. "Hello?" The voice was gruffer than Walter remembered, aged by time and retirement, like sandpaper worn rough. "Frank? It's Walter Harrington." "Walter?" Frank's surprise was evident. "Haven't heard from you in a long time. Must be important to call this late." Walter's throat felt dry as desert sand. He cleared it, adjusting his reading glasses nervously. "I need to ask about the Carter case." The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long, filled only by the sound of breathing. Finally, Frank spoke, his voice lower, more cautious, as if someone might be listening. "That case wasn't clean." Walter's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean?" "There were whispers, Walter. The kind nobody wanted to hear. The kind that could end careers." Frank sighed heavily, the sound of a man unburdening himself. Detective Morrison was under pressure. The department needed a win after that string of unsolved robberies. Walter's free hand clenched into a fist, his manicured nails digging into his palm. "Are you saying Morrison pushed for a conviction regardless of evidence?" "He had a reputation for it. Aggressive tactics, pushing witnesses, making things fit." Frank paused. The silence waited with unspoken implications. "Look, I still have my old case notes in storage. Let me dig through them, see what I can find. Maybe there's something we all missed." "I'd appreciate that," Walter managed, his voice barely steady, threatening to crack with each word. After hanging up, Walter slumped in his chair, pressing his fingers against his temples where a headache was building like a gathering storm. The storm outside grew louder, lightning briefly illuminating the room in harsh white flashes. His eyes fell on the stack of files spread across his desk, witness statements full of inconsistencies, police reports that didn't quite align, evidence that seemed solid at first glance but crumbled under closer scrutiny like a sandcastle in the tide. The truth he'd been avoiding hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. This case wasn't just flawed, it might be entirely wrong. 25 years of a man's life, gone. Because he hadn't looked closely enough. Because he'd trusted a system that was more interested in closing cases than finding truth. Because he'd been young and ambitious, and certain of his own judgment. For the first time, Walter allowed himself to say the words out loud, his voice barely a whisper in the empty room, each word falling like lead. "I might have ruined an innocent man's life." The admission hung in the air, heavier than the storm clouds outside, a weight that threatened to crush him beneath its terrible truth. The morning light filtered weakly through Walter's study windows, casting long shadows across the scattered papers on his desk. His coffee sat untouched, wisps of steam no longer rising from the dark surface. The dregs had settled at the bottom, forming a muddy ring against the white ceramic. The night storm had passed, but Walter felt the lingering heaviness in the air, matching the weight in his chest as thunder still echoed in his memory. Marcus Carter's case file lay open before him, its pages dog-eared and marked with sticky notes in various colors, each representing a different inconsistency he'd discovered. Some of the pages were worn thin at the corners from repeated handling. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, punching in numbers he hadn't dialed in years. Each ring seemed to stretch forever, until a familiar gravelly voice broke through. "Harrington?" James Holloway's tone carried surprise and something else. Wariness, perhaps. The voice was rougher than Walter remembered, aged by time and cigarettes. Walter steadied himself, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "I need to talk about Marcus Carter." The silence that followed felt thick enough to cut. Finally, Holloway exhaled sharply, the sound harsh against the receiver. "That case is closed, Walter." "I think we missed something." Walter's fingers drummed against his desk, a nervous habit he'd never quite shaken. The steady tap-tap-tap echoed in the quiet room. "You signed the damn sentence yourself," Holloway snapped. "We did everything by the book." Walter's jaw tightened, muscles clenching beneath his skin. "Then why did the key witness recant?" He heard Holloway shift on the other end of the line, Papers rustled, suggesting he wasn't alone in revisiting old files. Ancient history, Walter. Don't go digging up old graves. Did you suppress evidence? Walter pressed harder, his voice gaining strength with each word. A bitter laugh crackled through the phone. You're losing it, Harrington. First the heart attack, now this. But Walter caught something in Holloway's tone. A slight tremor, a hint of nervousness that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but after decades on the bench, Walter knew the sound of someone hiding something. He'd heard that same quiver in countless testimonies. The line went dead with an abrupt click that seemed to echo in the quiet study. Walter slowly lowered the phone, his heart pounding against his ribs. The prosecution's confidence during the trial had seemed unshakable at the time. Now, looking back, he wondered if it had been more performance than substance, a carefully orchestrated show of certainty. He pulled his phone close again, opening his browser. The witness who recanted. That was the key. Someone knew the truth, and Walter was going to find them no matter what it cost him personally or professionally. His fingers moved across the screen, starting the search that could unravel everything he'd once believed about justice. The morning light grew stronger, but Walter barely noticed as he dove deeper into the past, determined to right an old wrong. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crumbling facade of the Cedar Grove apartments. Walter's polished shoes seemed out of place on the cracked concrete walkway as he approached Unit 14B. Paint peeled from the doorframe, and a rusty security gate hung slightly askew. The sound of distant traffic and children playing somewhere in the complex only emphasized the building's desolate atmosphere. Walter's knuckles rapped against the worn door. Silence answered. He knocked again, harder this time, his determination growing with each second. Finally, shuffling footsteps approached from inside, accompanied by the creak of old floorboards. The door opened a crack, held secure by a chain lock. A pair of bloodshot eyes peered out, set in a weathered face that bore the marks of a hard life. "I don't do interviews," the man growled, already starting to close the door, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. Walter wedged his foot in the gap, ignoring the bite of the door against his expensive leather shoe. "You recanted your testimony." The eyes widened slightly, and Bobby Tate's whole body tensed like a cornered animal. "I don't know what you're talking about." His voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something that sounded like fear, maybe even shame. Walter pulled out a folded paper from his coat pocket, holding it where Bobby could see. The yellowed edges spoke of its age. "You wrote this letter. You said Marcus Carter was innocent." Bobby's face hardened, lines deepening around his mouth like trenches. That was a long time ago. His fingers gripped the doorframe tighter, knuckles turning white with pressure. "Why did you lie in court?" Walter pressed, maintaining eye contact through the narrow opening, refusing to back down. Bobby's shoulders sagged. He exhaled shakily, the sound of a man carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "I didn't lie. I was convinced." The chain lock rattled as Bobby finally opened the door wider. His apartment smelled of stale cigarettes and instant coffee, the air thick with decades of regret. He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, which stuck up in uneven patches. "Detective Morris," Bobby continued, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling with suppressed emotion. "He made it clear what would happen if I didn't play ball. Said they'd pin me as an accomplice. I had priors. Nobody would believe me over a cop. He knew exactly which buttons to push." Walter felt his blood run cold, a chill creeping up his spine. The case hadn't just been mishandled. It had been deliberately manipulated. Years of certainty about the justice system crumbled around him like a house of cards. Bobby slumped onto a worn armchair, springs creaking under his weight. "I tried to fix it, wrote that letter. Called the public defender's office. Nobody cared. Nobody wanted to hear it. They all just wanted it to go away." Walter gripped the paper tighter, his knuckles white. This wasn't just about one wrong conviction anymore. The entire system had failed Marcus Carter, and he had been complicit in that failure. The weight of this revelation pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The desk lamp cast a harsh glow across scattered papers as Walter paced his study, his shoes clicking against hardwood floors. Old police records lay spread before him, their yellowed pages filled with fading type. His fingers trembled slightly as he cross-referenced details from Marcus's trial, searching for something, anything, he might have missed. The late-night silence seemed to mock his growing unease. Then he saw it. His hand froze mid-turn of a page. Another robbery, 6 months after Marcus's sentencing. The details jumped out at him. Same type of store, same time of night, same method. But a different suspect. Darius D. Malone. Walter's throat went dry as he read the report. Malone was a repeat offender, currently serving time for another crime. The similarities were too stark to ignore. "Dear God," Walter whispered, sinking into his chair. Could he have put away the wrong man? The thought made his chest tighten with a mix of dread and shame. His hands shook as he pulled out the original case files. The ballistics report caught his eye. He'd forgotten about this. The gun had never been conclusively tied to Marcus. And the fingerprints found at the scene? He flipped through more pages, his stomach turning. They'd never been tested against anyone else. The oversight was glaring now, a neon sign of negligence that he'd somehow missed all those years ago. Walter gripped his pen so hard his knuckles turned white. The truth hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just made a mistake. He'd failed completely in his duty as a judge. Years of pride in his careful deliberations crumbled like sand through his fingers. Reaching for his phone, he dialed Frank Delaney's number. The clock on his desk showed 9:47 p.m. His heart pounded as he waited through 3 rings. "What now, Harrington?" Frank's voice was thick with sleep. "Frank, I found something." Walter's words tumbled out as he explained about Malone, the matching robbery patterns, the untested evidence. He could hear the urgency in his own voice, barely controlled. The line went quiet. Finally, Frank muttered, "Jesus Christ." "Tell me about Detective Howard," Walter pressed, the lead investigator on Carter's case. He held his breath, dreading what he might hear. Frank's heavy sigh crackled through the phone. "Howard. He was dirty, Walter. Everyone knew it but couldn't prove it. Took payoffs to close cases fast. He's dead now. Liver failure 3 years ago." The words landed like stones in Walter's gut. Walter's jaw clenched as the pieces fell into place. The corruption hadn't just been sloppy police work. It had been intentional. He grabbed a notepad and wrote down one name in bold letters: Darius Malone. This was his next step. He needed to talk to him face to face. Maybe this was the key to undoing the damage he'd helped cause. "Thanks, Frank," Walter said, hanging up the phone. He stared at Malone's name on the pad, the weight of 25 years of injustice pressing down on his shoulders. The night suddenly felt very long, and he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. The morning sun cast long shadows through the barred windows of Meadowbrook Correctional Facility, creating stark patterns on the scuffed linoleum floor. Walter sat at a cold metal table, his hands folded neatly in front of him, fighting to keep them steady. The room smelled of bleach and stale air, with undertones of sweat and desperation that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each heavy second with mechanical precision. The heavy steel door groaned open, hinges protesting. 2 guards escorted Darius Malone inside, their faces set in practiced neutrality. He moved with a predator's grace despite his prison jumpsuit, his muscular frame speaking of years of working out in the yard, of hours spent building strength between concrete walls. A long scar ran down his right cheek, pale against his dark skin, a reminder of some untold violence. His eyes, sharp and calculating, sized Walter up like a lion studying potential prey. "A judge visiting me? That's a first?" Darius's voice was rough, like gravel on pavement. He lowered himself into the chair across from Walter, the metal scraping against the floor as he settled in, a slight smirk playing at his lips. Walter's fingers trembled slightly as he placed the worn case file on the table, its edges softened by years of handling. The sound of paper hitting metal seemed to echo in the small room, impossibly loud in the confined space. Darius's eyes flickered to the file and his smirk widened, knowing and cruel. "Oh, this is about Carter." Walter felt his shoulders stiffen, tension climbing up his spine. The casual way Darius said the name made his stomach turn, bile threatening at the back of his throat. Darius leaned back in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight, completely at ease in his domain. "That poor bastard. Guess he took my fall, huh?" The words hit Walter like a physical blow, forcing the air from his lungs. His mouth went dry, tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. "So you're admitting it?" A low, rough laugh filled the room, bouncing off the bare walls. "Ain't admitting nothing." Darius's eyes glittered with dark amusement. "But you already know, don't you? Been keeping you up at night, I bet." Walter pressed forward, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Why didn't you confess?" "Why would I?" Darius shrugged, the gesture almost lazy, almost mocking. Cops needed a scapegoat. Carter was perfect. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than a man's ruined life, rather than 25 years stolen. Walter's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white under the harsh fluorescent lights. The confirmation of what he'd suspected felt like ice in his veins, freezing him from the inside out. Marcus was innocent, but knowing it and proving it were two different things entirely. He needed more than just Darius's casual remarks. He needed an official statement, something that would stand up in court, something that could finally bring justice. Walter leaned in, his voice low and urgent, nearly pleading. "Help me clear his name." Darius's smirk returned wider than before, revealing a flash of teeth. His eyes gleamed with calculation, a predator sensing opportunity. "What's in it for me?" Walter exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. The clock continued its steady ticking, marking the silence between them. Each second another moment of Marcus Carter's life slipping away behind bars. Walter strode through the glass doors of the district attorney's office, his footsteps echoing across the polished marble floor. The modern building felt sterile and cold, much like the justice system it represented. Young attorneys in crisp suits rushed past, carrying stacks of files and paper cups of coffee, too busy climbing the career ladder to notice the retired judge. The familiar smell of printer ink and coffee filled the air, bringing back memories of countless days spent in similar halls of power. At the front desk, a secretary in her 40s looked up from her computer screen. Her eyes widened with recognition, her fingers freezing over the keyboard. "Judge Harrington? Do you have a meeting scheduled?" Her voice carried the nervous tone of someone caught between protocol and respect for authority. Walter walked past her desk without breaking stride, his shoulders set with determination. "Tell Jonathan Reed I need to see him. Now." The words came out clipped and sharp, brooking no argument. Before the secretary could respond, a tall figure appeared in a doorway down the hall. Jonathan Reed adjusted his silk tie, a practiced smile crossing his face. His perfectly tailored suit and carefully styled gray hair spoke of ambition and power. He stood with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to having his way. "Walter, haven't seen you in a while." Reed's voice carried a hint of amusement, like a cat playing with its prey. Inside Reed's office, with its wall of legal books and framed achievements, Walter wasted no time. He dropped the worn Carter file onto the pristine desk with a heavy thud. "Marcus Carter is innocent. We have the wrong man." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Reed settled into his leather chair and casually flipped through the yellowed pages. His manicured fingers traced the edges of documents that had destroyed a man's life. Sunlight streaming through the window caught the gold of his watch as he moved. This case was closed years ago. Walter planted his hands on the desk, leaning forward. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, each word precise and measured. "The witness was coerced. The real culprit is already in prison. You need to vacate the sentence." A small chuckle escaped Reed's lips as he shook his head, his expression one of patronizing patience. "And what would that say about our justice system if we admit this mistake? People lose faith. Cases collapse. He closed the file with a dismissive snap that echoed in the quiet office. Number, there's no political win in reopening this. This isn't about politics, Walter growled, his temper rising. The muscles in his neck tightened as he fought to maintain control. It's about a man's life. Reed's expression hardened, his earlier amusement vanishing like morning frost. It's out of my hands. Only an appeal can overturn the conviction. He straightened a pen on his desk, a nervous tell that betrayed his casual demeanor. Walter's jaw clenched tight. Then I'll take it to court myself. Another smirk crossed Reed's face as he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. You do that, but don't expect the system to bend so easily. Walter snatched the file from the desk and stormed out, leaving Reed's smug expression behind. His shoes clicked against the marble floor as he headed for the exit, his mind already racing with plans to assemble a legal team. The weight of Marcus's file in his hands felt like both a burden and a promise. The law office was small but tidy, tucked away in a brick building on the quieter side of town. Morning light filtered through dusty Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across stacks of legal books and case files. The faint smell of coffee and old paper hung in the air. Walter shifted in the worn leather chair, its familiar creak breaking the silence as he watched Claire Donovan's face while she studied Marcus Carter's file. Claire's reputation preceded her. She'd overturned 3 wrongful convictions in the past 2 years alone, making her something of a legend in legal circles. Her dark-rimmed glasses sat low on her nose as she flipped through the yellowed pages, her expression unreadable. A strand of gray hair had escaped her neat bun, but she seemed too focused to notice. It's weak, she said bluntly, looking up at Walter with eyes sharpened by years of experience. Walter felt his face flush, heat creeping up his neck. Excuse me? Claire set down the file and leaned back in her chair, her blazer creasing at the shoulders. The morning sun caught the silver threading in her dark suit. The DA won't budge. A judge won't grant an appeal unless we have undeniable new evidence. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of experience, of too many battles fought in courtrooms. Walter reached into his briefcase and pulled out Bobby Tate's affidavit, sliding it across the cluttered desk with steady fingers. The key witness recanted his testimony. Claire picked up the document, her eyes scanning each line carefully, her lips moving slightly as she read. After a moment, she gave a slight nod, the paper rustling as she set it down. This helps, but we need more. The real perpetrator all but admitted to the crime, Walter said through gritted teeth, remembering Darius Malone's smirking face and the arrogance in his voice. Claire's fingers drummed steadily on the desktop, her silver rings catching the light. But we need it on record. Without a formal confession, it's just hearsay. Walter nodded slowly, resignation settling in his chest. I'll go back to Malone. Get him to sign a confession. Claire pulled out a legal pad and began writing in quick, neat strokes, her pen scratching against the yellow paper. I'll start drafting the appeal. But Walter... She looked up, her expression serious, lines of concern etched around her mouth. You need to understand what you're getting into. The system doesn't like admitting mistakes. She set down her pen and leaned forward, her chair squeaking softly. If you go public with this, they'll come for you, Walter. You'll be torn apart. Walter felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. His reputation, his legacy, everything he'd built over decades. It could all crumble like a house of cards. But then he thought of Marcus Carter, sitting in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, counting days that should have been spent with his family. He thought of Ava, growing up without a father, her childhood stolen by injustice. I know, he said quietly, his voice firm despite its softness. But I have to fix this. Claire stood up and extended her hand across the desk, papers rustling beneath her movement. Her grip was firm, confident, a silent promise of support. Then let's win. The flickering overhead light in Ava's apartment cast a harsh glow over her small kitchen table. Her dinner, a microwaved frozen meal, sat mostly untouched, the plastic tray growing cold. She pushed the rubbery vegetables around with her fork, her mind elsewhere. The sauce had congealed into an unappetizing mass, but she barely noticed. Every few minutes, she checked her phone, the screen remaining stubbornly blank. 20 years. That's how long her father had been locked away. She'd been just 2 years old when they took him. Now, at 22, she'd lived most of her life with prison visiting rooms as her only connection to him. The cold metal chairs, the scratched plexiglass, the tinny sound of his voice through the phone receiver. These were her childhood memories. The walls of her tiny apartment seemed to close in around her. Faded photographs hung in dollar store frames, memories of better times. Her father holding her as a baby, his smile wide and carefree. Her mother, still healthy and smiling, before grief and illness took her away. Ava's high school graduation photo, taken in her waitress uniform because she'd had to work right after the ceremony. The cheap camera flash had caught the exhaustion in her eyes, but she'd been smiling anyway, knowing her father would want to see her happy. A sharp knock cut through the silence, echoing off the bare walls. Ava jumped up, nearly knocking over her chair in her rush to the door. When she pulled it open, Walter stood there, his tall frame slightly stooped with exhaustion. His tie was loosened, and his suit jacket looked rumpled from a long day. But there was something different in his eyes, a determined gleam that made her heart race. He held out a thick stack of papers, his hands steady. Claire Donovan is filing an appeal. It's moving forward. Ava's fingers trembled as she took the documents. Legal terms jumped out at her. Motion to vacate. Newly discovered evidence. Witness recantation. The words swam together on the page as she blinked hard, trying to focus through the sudden blur of tears. This is really happening? Her voice came out barely above a whisper, cracking with emotion. Walter nodded, his expression grave but gentle. But it's going to be a fight. Ava sank onto her worn second-hand couch, the papers clutched to her chest like a lifeline. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, leaving dark spots on the top page. Walter lowered himself carefully onto the couch beside her, the old springs creaking under his weight. For once, he didn't try to explain or justify. He just listened, his presence steady and reassuring. Every birthday he'd send a card, Ava said softly, staring at the photographs on the wall. Always 3 weeks early to make sure it arrived on time. When I graduated high school, he wrote me this beautiful letter about how proud he was. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smudging her mascara. But he should have been there. He should have seen me walk across that stage. The silence in the apartment felt heavy with 2 decades of lost moments. Walter's shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. This wasn't just about correcting a legal error anymore. This was about a father who'd missed watching his daughter grow up. A family torn apart. A life stolen by a broken system. A system he'd been part of, had helped perpetuate with his own blindness and rigid beliefs. Ava straightened up, squaring her shoulders. She wiped the last traces of tears from her face, leaving streaks of black that she didn't bother to check in a mirror. When she spoke, her voice was steel. We have to win. Walter met her gaze, seeing not just the determined young woman before him, but also the little girl who'd grown up without her father. The weight of his responsibility settled deeper into his bones. We will. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy. Reporters clutched their notepads, their pens poised. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators who'd come to witness what could be a historic moment. Camera flashes occasionally lit up the high ceiling despite the judge's orders against photography. Walter tugged at his tie, feeling its constraint. Next to him, Claire Donovan arranged her files with precise movements, each document ready for battle. Across the aisle, Jonathan Reed's expensive suit seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights. His team of junior attorneys whispered in his ear, but his face remained impassive. In the front row, Ava sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her waitress uniform was replaced by a modest blue dress, the nicest thing she owned. Her eyes never left the empty judge's chair. All rise, the bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber. Judge Matthews, a stern woman in her 60s, swept into the courtroom. Her black robes rustled as she took her seat. "You may be seated," she announced, adjusting her reading glasses. "We're here today regarding the appeal of Marcus Carter versus the state. Ms. Donovan, you may proceed." Claire stood, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor, we have clear evidence of a wrongful conviction." She moved with purpose, presenting each piece of evidence like laying down cards in a high-stakes game. Bobby Tate's recanted testimony shows clear police coercion. The original investigation was mishandled, with key evidence ignored or suppressed. Reed's objection cut through the air. "Your Honor, this is merely speculation. Marcus Carter was convicted through proper legal channels." Judge Matthews raised her hand. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Donovan." Claire nodded, then paused for effect. "Your Honor, we have one final witness." She turned toward the heavy wooden doors. "The court calls Darius Malone." The doors creaked open. Darius walked in, his prison jumpsuit stark against the formal attire of the courtroom. Chains clinked with each step. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Walter watched Reed's composure crack for just a moment, a slight widening of the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. Ava leaned forward, her knuckles white. Darius took the stand, his face unreadable. The bailiff administered the oath. "Mr. Malone," Claire began, "do you know why you're here today?" "Yeah," Darius replied, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "I'm here to tell the truth." "And what is that truth?" Darius looked straight ahead, his words clear and deliberate. "Marcus Carter didn't do it. I did." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to write, spectators gasped and murmured. Reed shot to his feet with objections. Judge Matthews banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order in this court." The chaos slowly settled. Judge Matthews removed her glasses, rubbing her temples. "In light of this new testimony, I'll need time to review all evidence thoroughly. We'll reconvene when I've made my decision." She banged her gavel once more. "Court is adjourned." Walter and Ava walked out together, pushing through the crowd of reporters shouting questions. The autumn air hit their faces as they descended the courthouse steps. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time in 20 years, real change felt possible. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Walter's polished shoes squeaked against the marble floor as he shifted in his seat. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. Ava sat ramrod straight beside him, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. Claire arranged her legal papers with mechanical precision, though her tight jaw betrayed her tension. Judge Matthews adjusted his reading glasses, the rustling of papers deafening in the hushed courtroom. Walter studied the judge's face, searching for any hint of what was coming. 20 years of judicial experience had taught him to read these moments, but now his skills failed him. After careful review of the evidence presented, Judge Matthews began, his voice echoing off the high ceiling, including the testimony of Mr. Malone and the recanted witness statement. Walter's mouth went dry. Beside him, Ava leaned forward slightly. "The court finds that while new evidence has been presented, it does not conclusively meet the standard for overturning the original conviction." The words hit like physical blows. Ava shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What?" Her voice cracked with disbelief and fury. Claire's pen slammed against the wooden table. "They're protecting themselves," she muttered through clenched teeth, her knuckles white around the pen. Across the aisle, Jonathan Reed's smile was subtle but unmistakable. His team of attorneys nodded in satisfaction, gathering their expensive briefcases. "The defense may file for a secondary review," Judge Matthews continued, his voice steady and detached. "Until then, Mr. Carter's sentence remains in effect." Ava's shoulders slumped. "He's still in prison." The words came out barely above a whisper, heavy with defeat. Walter leaned forward, his voice rough with determination. "Not for long." Reporters surged forward like a wave, microphones thrust toward them, questions overlapping in a cacophony of demands for statements. Camera flashes sparked like lightning in the formal courtroom. Ava pushed through the crowd, tears threatening to spill. She disappeared through the heavy wooden doors, leaving chaos in her wake. Claire's hand gripped Walter's arm, her nails digging in slightly through his suit jacket. "We're not done," she said firmly. "There's another way." Walter exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of 2 decades of injustice pressing down on him. "Then we take it all the way." The courthouse buzzed around them, reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads, photographers jostling for better angles, and legal observers whispering among themselves. But Walter barely noticed any of it. His mind was already racing ahead, planning their next move. Walter's study felt smaller than usual that night, the walls pressing in as he sat before his laptop's glowing screen. The untouched whiskey caught the dim lamplight, amber liquid perfectly still. His hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. The cursor blinked steadily, waiting. Walter took a deep breath and began to type. "For 25 years I believed I upheld justice, but I was wrong." The words appeared stark and black against the white background. His stomach clenched, but he forced himself to continue. His fingers moved faster now, the truth pouring out like a confession. He detailed everything: how the police had pressured the witness, how evidence was overlooked, how the system had failed Marcus Carter. He named Detective Howard, described James Holloway's role, exposed the DA's office's refusal to acknowledge the truth. Each revelation felt like ripping off a bandage, painful but necessary. "I was part of a system that valued convictions over truth," he wrote. "I sentenced an innocent man to 25 years in prison. Marcus Carter lost decades of his life because I failed to see what was right in front of me." Walter paused, his hands shaking more now. The whiskey remained untouched. He read through his words again, checking every detail, every accusation. Then he read it once more. The truth stared back at him from the screen, undeniable and damning. His mouse cursor hovered over the publish button. One click would change everything: his reputation, his legacy, possibly his entire future. But Marcus had lost 25 years. What was a reputation compared to that? Walter clicked. Within the first hour, the post started spreading. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Legal blogs picked it up first, then local news sites. By the second hour, national outlets were calling. Comments flooded in. Some praised his courage. Others called him a traitor. Legal professionals expressed outrage, both at the original conviction and at his public confession. His phone rang. Ava's name flashed on the screen. "You really did it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes," Walter replied, though she couldn't see his nod. "Now let's see what happens." He reached over and closed his laptop with a soft click. The room fell into deeper darkness, broken only by the soft glow of his desk lamp. The whiskey still sat untouched, catching the light like amber memories of all his past certainties. The morning sun barely peeked through Walter's curtains when his phone started its relentless buzzing. He reached for it, his eyes still heavy with sleep, and found himself jolted awake by the flood of notifications. Hundreds of missed calls, thousands of social media mentions. His inbox overflowed with messages. On his TV, every news channel showed his face. Reporters spoke in serious tones. Breaking news. Former Judge Walter Harrington admits to wrongful conviction in shocking online confession. The justice system faces serious questions. Walter sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his gray hair. His confession had opened the floodgates. There was no turning back now. In her small apartment across town, Ava sat cross-legged on her worn couch, watching the coverage through tear-filled eyes. Her phone buzzed, another message from her father's prison. The guard said he'd seen the news too. Claire's call cut through the chaos. "Walter," she said, her voice charged with excitement. "The governor saw your confession. His office wants a meeting, tomorrow morning." Walter's heart jumped. "Really?" "Yes, this is our chance, Walter. Real leverage." Outside his house, reporters had already gathered. Their cameras flashed through his windows, voices calling out questions. But across town, in his pristine office, DA Jonathan Reed slammed his fist on his mahogany desk, making his coffee cup rattle. "That senile old fool," Reed growled, watching the coverage. "He just made himself a target. He grabbed his phone, barking orders to his staff. The clemency request landed on the governor's desk within hours. Social media exploded with number-free Marcus Carter hashtags. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, their signs demanding justice, their voices growing louder by the hour. Reed called an emergency press conference, adjusting his tie as he faced the cameras. Judge Harrington's claims are nothing more than the guilty conscience of an aging man. His mental state is clearly compromised. But Walter didn't flinch. He straightened his jacket, checked his reflection one last time, and opened his front door. Camera flashes exploded in his face. Microphones thrust toward him. Questions overlapped into a wall of noise. He raised his hand and somehow they fell quiet. Looking directly into the nearest camera, his voice steady and clear, he spoke the words he should have said 25 years ago. Marcus Carter is innocent, and I won't stop until he's free. The reporters erupted again, but Walter stood firm, his message delivered. The truth was finally out. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the governor's office, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Walter shifted in his leather chair, aware of every creak, every breath in the imposing room. Beside him, Claire sat perfectly still, her briefcase resting against her leg. Governor Richard Calloway studied them from behind his massive oak desk, his silver hair catching the light. The American flag stood proudly in one corner, while the walls were lined with leather-bound law books and carefully arranged photographs of political achievements. "This is a hell of a mess you've made, Walter," Calloway said, his voice carrying the weight of decades in politics. His fingers drummed slowly on his desk blotter. Walter met the governor's gaze without flinching. "It was already a mess. I just exposed it." The governor sighed, leaning back in his chair. The leather creaked softly. "If I reopen this, I need ironclad proof. The political fallout alone." Claire smoothly slid a thick manila folder across the polished desk. "Here it is." Her voice was confident, professional. Calloway opened the folder, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. The only sound in the room was the gentle whisper of papers being turned. His expression grew more serious with each page, his brow furrowing deeper as he reached Darius Malone's signed confession. The governor's breath caught slightly. He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. This is damning." The words hung heavy in the air. Walter felt his heart pounding against his ribs, watching as Calloway stood and walked to the window. The governor stared out at the city below, hands clasped behind his back. Finally, he turned. "I'll schedule an emergency review." Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "How soon?" 3 days, Calloway replied. "I'll notify the Board of Pardons immediately." As they left the office, Claire touched Walter's arm. "Reed isn't going down without a fight." Her eyes were serious, concerned. Walter nodded, his jaw set firmly. "Neither are we." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each precious second. In 3 days, Marcus Carter would either walk free or remain behind bars forever. The weight of that reality pressed down on Walter's shoulders as they walked through the marble halls of the Capitol building. The grand courtroom of the state capitol buzzed with tension as sunlight filtered through towering windows, casting long shadows across the ornate wood paneling. Walter's collar felt tight as he sat rigidly beside Claire, their shoulders nearly touching. In the row behind them, reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, while photographers adjusted their cameras. Ava perched on the edge of her seat, her fingers twisting the hem of her blazer. She'd barely slept the night before, hope and fear warring in her stomach. This was supposed to be it, the day her father finally got justice. Judge Millstone's voice carried across the hushed room as he read from the case file, his wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. The evidence presented shows significant irregularities in the original conviction of Marcus Carter. Walter's hands clenched into fists on his lap. 25 years of wrong decisions had led to this moment. He could feel the weight of every board member's gaze as they studied the documents before them. "This is an unusual case," Millstone continued, his tone measured, "but the evidence is compelling." Just as Walter rose to deliver his prepared statement, the heavy doors burst open. Jonathan Reed strode in, his expensive suit pristine, a team of lawyers trailing behind him like shadows. The room erupted in whispers. "I have new information," Reed announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The smirk playing at the corners of his mouth made Walter's blood run cold. Ava's sharp intake of breath echoed in the sudden silence. Reed approached the board, producing a manila folder with flourish. There's reason to believe Marcus Carter was not, in fact, innocent. New eyewitness testimony suggests he was at the scene of the crime after all. "That's a lie!" Claire shot to her feet, her usually composed demeanor cracking. Her voice trembled with barely contained fury. Judge Millstone frowned, his weathered hands carefully opening the new file. The board members huddled closer, their whispered conversations creating a low hum of uncertainty. Walter watched helplessly as months of progress threatened to unravel before his eyes. The board chair's weary sigh seemed to echo off the walls. "We need to review this. The decision is postponed." "No!" Ava jumped up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can't do this!" Her voice cracked with desperation. The sharp crack of the gavel cut through her protest. "This hearing is adjourned." Ava turned on her heel, pushing past the crowd of reporters. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floor as she fled the courtroom, leaving behind a wake of shocked whispers and clicking cameras. Walter watched her go, his chest tight with guilt and anger. They had been so close enough to taste victory. Now it was slipping through their fingers like sand, and he couldn't help but feel responsible for giving Reed the time to manufacture this last-minute obstacle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Walter and Ava made their way through the crowd. Signs bobbed up and down. "Free Marcus Carter" and "Justice Now," held by dozens of supporters who had gathered since dawn. Camera flashes burst like lightning as reporters shouted questions. Walter's hand trembled slightly as he straightened his tie. After weeks of fighting, it all came down to this moment. Ava walked beside him, her face a mask of determination, despite the dark circles under her eyes. Claire Donovan met them at the top of the steps, clutching a thick manila folder. Her navy suit was crisp, her expression fierce. "Reed is pushing to get this new testimony verified. We have to dismantle it." Walter nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Then let's do it." Inside the packed courtroom, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Claire's heels clicked against the floor as she approached the witness stand. The former cellmate, a thin man with shifty eyes, fidgeted under her steady gaze. "Mr. Phillips," Claire began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "When exactly did Mr. Malone supposedly confess this to you?" About 3 years ago, during yard time." "Interesting." Claire pulled out a document. "According to prison records, you and Mr. Malone were never housed in the same facility during that time period." The man's face paled. Under Claire's relentless questioning, his story crumbled. Finally, he broke. "Okay, the DA offered to reduce my sentence if I testified." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Walter watched Reed's face turn an ugly shade of red. The judge called for order, then sat in silence for 5 long minutes. When he finally spoke, his words rang with finality. "This court finds Marcus Carter's conviction to be legally flawed and the result of prosecutorial misconduct. His conviction is overturned. Mr. Carter is hereby released effective immediately." The courtroom erupted. Cheers and sobs filled the air. Ava grabbed Walter's arm, tears streaming down her face. Walter felt the weight of 25 years lift from his shoulders as he let out a long breath. Reed stormed out, shoving past reporters who were already rushing forward with microphones and cameras. Questions flew like arrows. "Judge Harrington, how does it feel to right this wrong?" "Ms. Carter, what will you say to your father?" Through it all, Ava kept hold of Walter's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "He's free." Walter smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in years. The evening air carried a hint of autumn as Walter stood rigidly at the prison gates, his polished shoes reflecting the setting sun. His best charcoal suit felt tight around his collar, and he tugged at it nervously. The massive walls of Redwood State Penitentiary loomed behind him, casting long shadows across the visitor parking lot. Ava couldn't stay still. She paced back and forth, her worn sneakers scuffing against the pavement. Every few seconds, she checked her phone for the time, though only minutes had passed. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed her dark hair behind her ears. "It's really happening," she whispered, more to herself than to Walter. Her voice caught on the words. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A guard appeared at the gate control booth, and the ancient mechanism groaned to life. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air as the heavy iron gates slowly parted. A tall figure emerged from the shadows of the prison entrance. Marcus Carter stepped into the fading daylight, carrying a small paper bag of belongings. He wore plain clothes provided by the prison, a white button-down shirt and khaki pants that hung loose on his lean frame. 25 years of imprisonment had left their mark. Gray peppered his temples, and deep lines creased his face. He squinted against the setting sun, scanning the horizon as if trying to remember what freedom looked like. Then his eyes found Ava. She let out a small gasp, the sound catching in her throat. "Dad," she breathed, and suddenly she was moving, running forward with tears already streaming down her face. Marcus hesitated for just a moment, as if unsure this was real. Then his arms opened, and Ava crashed into them. He held her tightly, his large hands trembling as they pressed against her back. His eyes squeezed shut, and tears leaked from the corners. "My baby girl," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "My baby girl." Walter stood back, watching the reunion. His chest felt tight as years of guilt and regret pressed down on him. He had put this man away, torn this family apart. Now, watching them embrace, he felt the weight of those lost decades lifting, not disappearing but shifting into something different. After what seemed like both an eternity and no time at all, Marcus and Ava separated slightly. Marcus turned, his eyes meeting Walter's. The two men stared at each other, decades of pain and unanswered questions hanging in the space between them. The silence stretched out, filled only by the sound of distant traffic and Ava's quiet sniffles. Then Marcus took a step forward, his movement deliberate and measured. He extended his hand toward Walter. Walter looked at the offered hand, remembering the last time he'd seen Marcus, in his courtroom, being led away in chains. Slowly, he reached out and grasped Marcus's hand. Their handshake was firm, speaking volumes in its silence. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Ava watched them, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. The last rays of sunlight caught the wetness on her face, making it shine. Together they walked toward Ava's old Honda parked in the visitor's lot. Marcus's steps were measured, almost cautious, as if he was relearning how to walk in open spaces. For the first time in 25 years, Marcus Carter was a free man. The neon sign of Lou's Diner buzzed softly in the growing darkness, its red and blue lights casting a warm glow through the foggy windows. Inside, the smell of grilled onions and fresh coffee filled the air. The vinyl booth squeaked as Marcus Carter settled into his seat, his prison-issued belongings stuffed in a small paper bag beside him. He stared down at the plate before him, a thick burger topped with melted cheese, crispy golden fries scattered around the edges, and a tall chocolate milkshake sweating in its glass. His hands hovered over the food, as if unsure it was real. Ava sat close beside him, her eyes glistening with tears as she watched her father. "Eat, Dad," she encouraged softly, her voice gentle. "It's all yours." Walter sat across from them, feeling like an intruder in this intimate moment between father and daughter. He fiddled with his napkin, uncertain of his place here. Marcus picked up the burger with trembling hands and took a careful bite. His eyes closed, and something like pain crossed his face. "I forgot what this tasted like," he said quietly, setting the burger down. 25 years of prison food. You forget. Ava gripped his arm, her fingers tight around his worn sleeve. "You never have to go back." Her voice was fierce, protective. Walter cleared his throat, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I know an apology isn't enough." Marcus set his food down and looked directly at Walter, his gaze steady. "It's not," he agreed honestly, no anger in his voice. just truth. But you did what most wouldn't. You made it right. The diner's night crowd was thin, a couple of truckers at the counter, an elderly couple sharing pie by the window. Their voices created a gentle murmur that filled the silence as Marcus spoke about his life inside. The hardest part was not letting hope in, he said, absently stirring his milkshake with the straw. Hope can break you in there, so I learned to live without it. Ava wiped tears from her cheeks as she shared stories of everything he'd missed. Her high school graduation, her first job, the small victories and crushing defeats of growing up without him. Walter listened, each word a reminder of the cost of his mistake. "What happens now?" Ava finally asked, turning to Walter with questioning eyes. Walter looked down at his coffee, the answer not yet clear. But before he could respond, Marcus lifted his milkshake glass. "To freedom," he said simply. They all raised their glasses, milkshakes and coffee, and clinked them together. The world outside the diner windows was different now, but then again, so were they. The morning sun cast long shadows across the park's winding paths, its gentle warmth barely cutting through the crisp autumn air. Walter sat on a weathered wooden bench, both hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup, steam rising in delicate wisps. His breath came out in small clouds as he watched early morning joggers pass by. He spotted Marcus approaching from the path, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. The man walked differently now, slower, more deliberate, as if still adjusting to the wide-open spaces after decades of confined movement. For the first time in 25 years, they faced each other as free men, as equals. Walter stood, uncertainty written across his features. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression guarded but not hostile. "I wasn't sure either." They fell into step together along the leaf-strewn path, their footsteps crunching against the ground. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words and old wounds. Children laughed in the distance at a nearby playground, the sound somehow making the quiet between them more pronounced. Walter finally broke the silence, his voice steady but gentle. "I can't change the past, but I want to help you move forward." Marcus exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "I don't know what moving forward even looks like." His voice carried the weight of lost years, of a life interrupted. Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a carefully folded slip of paper. "It looks like this." He handed it to Marcus, who unfolded it with careful fingers. It was a job offer at a construction company owned by Walter's old friend, complete with a glowing recommendation letter. Marcus stared at the paper, then lifted his gaze to meet Walter's. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I owe you," Walter replied, his voice firm and clear. "Because it's the right thing." Marcus studied the paper again, running his thumb along its edge. After a long moment, he extended his hand toward Walter. Walter took it, and as they shook hands, something shifted between them. The bitterness that had defined their relationship melted away, replaced by something closer to understanding. Their handshake lingered, both men acknowledging without words the significance of this moment. As they stood there in the morning light, the weight of decades seemed to lift just a little. The evening sun cast long shadows through Ava's small apartment windows as she moved around her tiny kitchen, checking the pot of beef stew simmering on the stove. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the plates on her second-hand dining table, the nice ones she'd bought specially for this moment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 7. Ava's heart raced with each passing minute. She straightened the tablecloth for the 10th time, adjusted the napkins again. Everything had to be perfect for their first real dinner together. A knock at the door made her freeze. 3 gentle tap-alms on her jeans, and walked to the door. When she opened it, Marcus stood there, looking uncertain in his new clothes, a simple button-down shirt and khakis Walter had helped him buy. Tears welled in Ava's eyes as reality hit her again. "You're really here." Marcus stepped inside, his eyes taking in every detail of the small space. The mismatched furniture, the few family photos on the walls, the stack of waitressing uniforms folded on a chair. "This is nice," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. P's that seemed to echo through the apartment. Ava took a deep breath, wiped her sweaty. Ava couldn't contain herself anymore. She grabbed his arm and pulled him into a tight hug, nearly knocking him off balance. "I missed you so much," she whispered into his chest. Marcus wrapped his arms around her, closing his eyes tight against his own tears. "I missed everything." They moved to the table where steam rose from bowls of homemade stew. Marcus sat down slowly, as if afraid the scene might disappear. The smell of real home cooking, carrots, beef, herbs, brought back memories of his own mother's kitchen from what felt like a lifetime ago. "I learned Grandma's recipe," Ava said, watching him take his first bite. "I wanted you to taste something familiar." Marcus closed his eyes as he savored the food. When he opened them again, they were glistening. "It's perfect, baby girl." Over dinner, Ava began to share stories of her life, the struggles of growing up without him, visiting him in prison every weekend until she had to work, dropping out of college to make ends meet. Marcus listened intently, his heart heavy with each revelation of hardship she'd faced because of his absence. "I'm sorry," he said softly when she told him about working double shifts to afford the apartment. "I should have been there." "It wasn't your fault," Ava replied, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "And look, I made it. I'm okay." She told him about her job at the diner, her dreams of going where just father and daughter, sharing a meal, rebuilding what had been lost. Marcus gripped her hand tighter, his voice rough with emoji back to school someday, maybe becoming a social worker. For the first time, they weren't having a rushed conversation through prison glass or over a monitored phone line. They ion. "I can't get back the years we lost, but I can be here now." Ava nodded, tears slipping down her face as she squeezed his hand back. "That's all I ever wanted." Walter sat at his mahogany desk, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of his home office. Papers were scattered across the polished surface, case files, legal documents, and newspaper clippings about Marcus Carter's release. In the center lay a blank piece of letterhead, waiting for words that would end his career. His fingers drummed against the desk as he stared at the empty page. 40 years of law practice, 2 decades as a judge. His entire identity was wrapped up in this system. A system that had failed not just Marcus Carter, but how many others. He picked up his fountain pen, its weight familiar in his hand. Before he could write the first word, his phone rang. Claire Donovan's name flashed on the screen. "Walter," she said when he answered, her voice tight with concern. "I heard what you're planning. You don't have to do this." Walter rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him. "I do. If I stay, I'm part of the problem." The line went quiet. He could hear Claire's measured breathing, knew she was choosing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "Then do it on your terms." Something in her tone made him straighten. She was right. This wasn't just about stepping down. It was about speaking up. Walter placed his pen on the desk and turned to his computer. His fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose. He wrote about Marcus Carter, about a system that valued convictions over truth. He detailed the pressure on judges, the rush to judgment, the lives destroyed by hasty decisions. The words flowed easily now. He called for mandatory reviews of convictions, for stronger oversight of evidence handling, for better funding for public defenders. Each paragraph felt like lifting a weight from his shoulders. When he reached the end, he added his signature, not just his name, but his full title and credentials. Let them see exactly who was saying these things. Without hesitation, he sent the letter to every major news outlet in the state. Then he leaned back in his leather chair, feeling lighter than he had in years. The next morning's headline in the State Tribune read exactly as he'd hoped. "Retired judge admits to flawed convictions, calls for justice reform." Walter sat in his office holding the newspaper. For the first time since this all began, he felt truly at peace. He had finally done the right thing. Marcus walked down Main Street, his steps slow and deliberate. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the air hummed with the sounds of city life. Cars honking, people chattering, music drifting from store windows. After 25 years of concrete walls and metal bars, every sensation felt new, almost overwhelming. The scent of talcum powder and aftershave caught his attention. He stopped in front of Joe's barbershop, staring at the spinning red and white pole outside. Through the window, he watched men getting haircuts, engaged in casual conversation. Something so normal, so everyday, yet he hadn't experienced it in decades. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed open the door. A small bell chimed above him. The barber, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, looked up from his customer. "First time here?" the barber asked, his tone friendly but curious. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "First time in a long time." The barber gestured to an empty chair. "Have a seat. I'll be with you in about 10 minutes." Marcus settled into one of the waiting chairs, picking up an old magazine. The pages felt strange under his fingers, different from the worn prison library books he was used to. When his turn came, he sank into the barber's chair, the leather creaking beneath him. The barber draped a striped cape around his shoulders. "What are we thinking today?" Marcus stared at his reflection in the mirror. Gray streaked his temples, and deep lines marked his face. But for the first time, he didn't see an inmate number or a prison jumpsuit. He saw possibility. "Something professional," he said quietly. "Something new." The barber nodded, understanding in his eyes. As he worked, Marcus watched the transformation. Each snip of the scissors seemed to cut away another piece of his past. After paying, Marcus stepped back onto the sidewalk, running a hand through his fresh haircut. He felt different, lighter somehow. As he walked, a sign in a hardware store window caught his eye. "Help wanted. Full-time position available." Marcus paused, his heart beating faster. Walter's words echoed in his mind about moving forward, about starting over. After a moment's hesitation, he pushed open the door. The store smelled of sawdust and metal. Tools lined the walls and fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Behind the counter, a man in his 60s looked up from a ledger. "You looking for work?" the owner asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Marcus stood straighter. "Yeah, I am." The owner studied him for a moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a form. "Fill this out. We need someone who can lift heavy stuff and knows their way around tools." Marcus took the application, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. "Thank you." Outside, he found a bench and sat down. The application lay in his lap. Name, address, work history. His fingers tightened around the paper. A job. Such a simple thing, but it represented so much more. Freedom. A chance to rebuild. For the first time since walking out of those prison gates, Marcus allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. The evening crowd bustled outside the coffee shop windows, their shadows dancing across the warm interior. Inside, the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and pastries created a cozy atmosphere that felt worlds away from courtrooms and prison cells. Ava wrapped her hands around her steaming mug, her fingers tracing the ceramic rim. Her eyes held a different kind of intensity now. Not the burning anger from before, but something more contemplative. Walter sat across from her, his own coffee untouched, watching as she gathered her thoughts. "So what happens now?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but clear. Walter exhaled slowly, his weathered hands resting on the table. The question carried weight, more than just casual curiosity. "I don't know," he admitted, studying his reflection in the dark coffee. "I spent my whole life believing in the law. Turns out the law isn't always justice." Ava nodded, understanding flickering across her face. "So what do you do when everything you believed in turns out to be wrong?" A small, tired smile crossed Walter's face. "You start over." The words hung between them, simple but profound. Ava leaned back, really looking at him now. The stern judge who had sentenced her father was gone, replaced by someone more human, more real. "Do you regret it?" Not just the ruling, everything. Walter took his time answering, weighing each word carefully. I regret not questioning myself sooner. Steam curled up from their cups as Ava shifted in her seat. Are you staying in the legal world? After everything? Walter shook his head. I'm done with the courts, he said firmly. But not with justice. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out some papers. I've been working on this, a foundation dedicated to reviewing wrongful convictions, using my connections, my experience, to make things right. Ava took the papers, scanning them with interest. Her expression softened. That's a good thing. Walter couldn't help but smirk slightly. Coming from you, that means a lot. Ava finished the last sip of her coffee, setting the cup down with a gentle clink. When she looked at Walter again, the resentment that had burned in her eyes for so long was gone, replaced by something close to respect. For the first time since their paths had crossed, they truly understood each other. Later that night, the grandfather clock in Walter's hallway struck 10, its deep chimes echoing through the empty house. Walter stood in his doorway, key still in hand, feeling the weight of the day settle around him. The house seemed different now, less like a fortress of legal certainty, and more like what it really was, just a house, filled with memories both bitter and sweet. He made his way to his study, his footsteps quiet against the hardwood floors. The room looked exactly as it always had, walls lined with leather-bound law books, certificates in heavy frames, case files stacked neatly on sturdy shelves. But something felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, less oppressive. Walter's fingers traced along the spines of his law books, feeling the embossed letters beneath his touch. These books had been his companions for decades, his guides through countless cases. He paused at the shelf where Marcus Carter's file sat, that familiar manila folder that had changed everything. With careful hands, he lifted the file. Its weight felt different now. What was once just another case number had become a story of redemption, both for Marcus and himself. He opened it one last time, the pages worn from countless readings over the past weeks. The old documents stared back at him. The original police report, the witness statements, the conviction papers bearing his own signature. Each page represented a piece of the puzzle he'd finally solved, though far too late. 25 years too late. Walter's chest tightened as he looked at Marcus's old mugshot. The young man in the photo stared back with defeated eyes that had haunted Walter's dreams since he'd realized his mistake. But now, that same man walked free, getting haircuts and filling out job applications, rebuilding a life that had been stolen from him. With a deep breath, Walter closed the file. This chapter was over. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but complete. He walked to the old filing cabinet in the corner, its metal surface reflecting the dim lamplight. The key turned with a solid click and he placed the file inside where it would stay. A reminder, but no longer a burden. Standing at his window, Walter looked out at the night sky. Stars peeked through breaks in the clouds, and for the first time in weeks, months, maybe years, he felt his shoulders relax. The guilt wasn't gone. It would never be gone completely. But it had transformed into something different. Something that pushed him forward instead of holding him back. He had made a terrible mistake, yes, but he had also found the courage to admit it, to fight against it, to make it right. That counted for something. Walter reached for the lamp switch, pausing for a moment to look around his study one last time. The room that had once felt like a temple to justice now felt more honest, more human. The shadows of his past decisions no longer seemed to loom quite so large. With a quiet click, he turned off the light. Darkness filled the room, but it wasn't the oppressive darkness of guilt anymore. It was just darkness, simple and clean. Walter stepped out, closing the door behind him. The courthouse lobby buzzed with anticipation, its marble floors reflecting the morning light that streamed through tall windows. Cameras clicked and flashed, creating a storm of light around the wooden podium. Reporters huddled together, their notepads ready, whispering among themselves as Walter Harrington approached the microphone. His steps were steady now, different from the uncertain shuffle he'd had during his hospital stay. He adjusted his tie, a simple blue one, not the formal black he'd worn as a judge, and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "For over 30 years I served as a judge," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "I believed I was upholding the law, but today I stand before you to say, sometimes the law gets it wrong." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Walter gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles whitening slightly. This was harder than any verdict he'd ever delivered. "That's why today I'm announcing the launch of the Harrington Foundation for Justice Reform," he continued, pulling out a prepared statement but barely glancing at it. "This foundation will be dedicated to reviewing wrongful convictions and helping innocent people get the second chance they deserve." He paused, his eyes finding Ava and Marcus at the back of the room. They stood together, Ava's hand gripping her father's arm. Marcus nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. "One man lost 25 years of his life because of a broken system," Walter said, his voice growing stronger. "It's my mission to make sure that never happens again." The questions came fast after that. Reporters raised their hands, shouting over each other. "Judge Harrington, how will you fund this foundation? What about your reputation in the legal community? Do you expect other judges to support your cause?" Walter answered each question carefully, his responses measured but honest. Claire Donovan stood in the crowd, arms crossed, giving him an approving nod when he mentioned partnering with existing innocence projects. Jonathan Reed's absence was notable. The last anyone had heard, he'd taken an indefinite leave of absence, his office under investigation for misconduct. As Walter finished the last question, advocates and activists pressed forward, hands extended. Former colleagues who'd avoided him weeks ago now wanted to shake his hand, to be part of this new chapter. Walter greeted each one, no longer wearing the black robes of a judge but standing taller than he ever had on the bench. In the back of the room, Ava squeezed her father's hand. Marcus watched Walter work the crowd, his expression thoughtful. The man who'd once sentenced him was now fighting to prevent others from suffering the same fate. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close to peace. The park's walking path stretched before Walter, winding through trees painted in autumn colors. The evening air carried a gentle chill, rustling leaves that crunched beneath his feet. His mind wandered to Marcus, to that morning they'd walked this same path together after his release. Footsteps crunched behind him. "Hey, Judge." Walter turned, surprised to see Ava standing there. She wore a worn denim jacket, hands tucked into the pockets, and something different in her expression. The hard edge that had been there since they first met was gone, replaced by a small, genuine smile. "I didn't expect to see you here," Walter said, his voice soft against the quiet evening. She stepped closer, autumn leaves dancing around her feet. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, but Walter could see her eyes clearly. Eyes that now held something he never thought he'd see directed at him. Respect. "Thank you," she said softly, the words hanging in the cool air between them. Walter swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. In his long career, he'd been called Your Honor, had received accolades and recognition. But this simple thank you from Ava meant more than all of those combined. He gave a small nod, his voice slightly rough. "You don't have to thank me. Just make sure your father gets that life he deserves." Ava's lips curved into a knowing smirk. "Oh, he will." They fell into step together, walking a few paces in comfortable silence. The tension that had defined their relationship from the beginning was gone, dissolved like morning mist. No trace remained of the anger, the bitterness, the accusations. In its place was something Walter hadn't expected: understanding. As they walked, Walter felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just an ending, the close of a dark chapter in all their lives. It was the beginning of something new, something hopeful. After a few moments, Ava turned toward a branching path. She gave Walter one last look, a slight nod, then walked away. He watched as she disappeared down the tree-lined trail, her figure growing smaller until she vanished completely. Standing alone on the path, Walter lifted his face to the sky, The evening air filled his lungs as he took a deep breath. Overhead, leaves rustled gently in the breeze. For the first time in decades, Walter Harrington felt like a good man. If you enjoyed the story of Walter, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.